All right, so welcome everyone, and a special welcome to you, Chris Lyddy. Many of you know me. I'm Tara Healey, the program director of Mind the Moment at Harvard Pilgrim, and I am delighted to be with Professor Chris Lyddy today. Chris is a pioneer in the science of mindfulness at work and an assistant professor of management at Providence College. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Chris to say a little bit more about his background before we get started with the Q&A. Chris?
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me, Tara. Hi, everyone. So as Tara mentioned, I am an assistant professor of management at Providence College, and all of my research really is around understanding mindfulness at work. Specifically, what are the impacts of mindfulness at work? How do we integrate mindfulness at work? What are the challenges or complexities that arise through integrating mindfulness at work? So that's my current gig. I've been there for, this will be my 5th year upcoming now. I did my PhD at Case Western Reserve University. I have prior degrees from the University of Michigan and MIT. And I also worked at the Brookings Institution, and as well as did a little bit of corporate research at MIT Sloan. So I've got a pretty diverse background, but you know, it's nice to find one's passion and actually get a chance to do it as a day job. So I feel very fortunate, and it's great to be here.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Chris. You know, listening to you, you have such an impressive, rich, and diverse background. And the fact that you're doing this work, I think, is pretty amazing. Tend to associate your profession with mindfulness. You know, it's not coupled automatically. So how did you come
That's being kind.
how did you come to mindfulness, both personally and professionally? What's the story?
Thanks, that's very kind. And you know, in many ways it found me. When I was a kid, you know, growing up, I really kind of struggled. You know, I think all of us have some level of teenage angst, and I think for me it was fairly acute. And you know, I was just trying to find my way through that and, you know, feel good about life, feel good about myself, and so on. And it was interesting, like, I tried a lot of different things, as one does. And I wasn't very old. I was maybe like 13. I picked up a book by Thich Nhat Hanh, and Pieces Every Step, actually. It's a beautiful book if you haven't seen it. And he writes so simply, and, you know, the concepts, or the ideas that he's sharing are so simple and straightforward, but, you know, it really resonated with me. And you know, so it kind of pinged around with me for a little while. It resonated. You know, he's just talking about washing the dishes lovingly or mindfully, and, you know, being there, and you know, having a cup of tea and really being full with that. You know, it's so simple. And just something opened up in me for about 3 days. It was just like a switch flipped, and I was just so present. I was so there in the moment and so appreciative, and like everything changed just for a little while. And I felt so great about everything. Like even how I interacted with people completely changed. How, you know, I wasn't very happy at school, and suddenly that was great. And then it all went away immediately. Like literally within an hour, it was just gone, and I was right back to where I was. Yeah, it was really powerful. And you know, it showed me that all this, you know, all my frustrations, all of, you know, like feeling unsettled, it really had basically nothing to do with my external context. It was entirely within me, because how else could it go? So how could my experience shift so radically, so quickly, with nothing externally happening? You know, it wasn't like, you know, it wasn't like there was a terrorist attack, or, you know, I won the lottery or anything. It was just like my normal mundane life, and suddenly my experience just completely shifted. So, you know, at that point I was completely hooked. I was like, wow, this is incredibly powerful stuff. And I felt deeply connected to it. Like, you know, anything else would be a lie, basically. But then, okay, great. You're still in high school. Like, what the heck do you do with that? Especially in the 90s, you know, maybe today it'd be a little clearer, but I just kind of buried it, I guess. I mean, it was always very meaningful for me, and I was, you know, I meditated a lot, and I read more books and so on. But you know, there was no clear career path at the time that you could even really envision. Funnily enough, I actually went to high school in Lexington, Mass, where John Kabat-Zinn lived. So little did I know the answer was literally down the road. So, you know, it just kind of kept going on and doing things that seemed interesting in terms of school and jobs and degrees. And I never really saw a way to integrate it into my professional work until I was, you know, about to start my PhD program. And a couple of people had said, oh, maybe you should study this whole presence thing, you know, or really being And it sounded crazy. I was like, who's interested in that? I was joining a PhD program in 2009, which, you know, in some ways is not very long ago, but in terms of mindfulness at work, it was like ages ago, right?
Yeah.
And so I said, you know what? The first day I showed up and I was like, you know, if it's meant to be, let it be. And, you know, the first day our professor's asking us, you know, like introduce ourselves basically. And I said, you know, or he said, what are you interested in? So I said, you know, I might do these other things that I said I would do, but I'm also really interested in, you know, studying presence. And he said, oh, really? Like, what led you to that? I was like, oh, I had a really powerful experience. He goes, well, was it chemically induced? And I said, no. Because he's like, oh, mine were. So apparently his advisor was Ram Dass, and they used to drop acid together.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
But point being, he was really open to it. So I was like, if that isn't a sign, I don't know what is. So
Yeah.
from then on, you know, it was a clear path. So I thought it was career suicide, but I was so passionate about it, I didn't really care. And then amazingly enough, the people gotten interested in it over time.
Yeah, really interesting story, Chris, because at such a young age, you know, you had this profound experience that you knew a kind of mental stability and joy really that was available, right?
And gratitude.
And it wasn't,
of gratitude.
yeah. And it's sort of like, in a way, it's like you started to back into it in some ways.
Yeah, the experience was clear before how I could translate that into some kind of professional conduit.
Right.
You know, it was a personal passion before it was a profession. And, you know, it's not clear, you know, I think, you know, a lot of businesses, it's about, you know, how do we optimize productivity and maximize profits? And,
right.
You know, like in business, academia, a lot of it's how do you optimize your brand and show strong research and so on, you know, and it's not necessarily the easiest fit with, you know, sort of this other experience. And somehow it seems to have worked pretty well for me, but, you know, it's sort of, I don't know, it sort of unfolded organically, I guess you could say. Like,
Sure.
I don't know that I can necessarily tell someone else how to make it work, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, you created certain conditions, and then there was this element of almost luck with the professor that, you know, I mean, so like it was like you had the perfect conditions for that to happen.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I feel truly fortunate about that.
yeah, yeah. So when you started, Chris, like in your early years, was there research that was inspiring to you that was already happening that you were like, oh, wait, there's this stuff that's actually going on right now? And did it inform some of the work you got into and studied?
Yeah, it's interesting. I made the leap before I realized there was actually some really good research into this area. Certainly, like if you look at Kirk Warren Brown's papers, there's been a couple in the 2000s that I think were phenomenal, really trying to define what mindfulness is, how you'd assess it, what impacts it would have. There's been a couple of papers in management that were also highly influential. There's a guy named Carl Weick who's, you know, if they gave out Nobel Prizes for management science, organizational science, he would have won. They don't, but, you know, he's kind of like, you know, everyone knows him. He's a huge legend in the field. Yeah. But he, interestingly enough, wrote a paper shortly, I think it was 2006, where he basically block quoted Mindfulness in Plain English and some other books. You know, wow. I mean, they're just like paragraphs basically wow. pasted in. And he was sort of exploring this idea of saying it was really, really interesting to think about and consider. So there was not a lot of research that was very clear. You know, it's not like there was 100 studies on how mindfulness affects people in business, but there was enough of a starting point, both from psychology and neuroscience, as well as in management, where you could kind of make a case that, hey, at least some interesting people have said some interesting things about this, even if they haven't really, you know, figured out every last little detail about it. So yes. Those are some of the things that got me started. There's a lot more that's come along since, but those are some.
Yeah, yeah. But that early research sounds in some ways that it was exciting for you to see, you know, that this was going on, and people were pulling from text and resources that kind of took your breath away a bit.
Yeah, really. I mean, it's pretty stunning to find this, you know, and, you know, I expected when I was getting into it, I expected, because, I'd been doing other stuff academically. I had no idea it was such an active area of research in psychology and neuroscience. And obviously that's continued to explode since. But, I had no idea there was so much rigor there, but I also didn't realize people were talking about it in the management context. So I just figured I was going to have to start from square one. Thankfully, I could start from like square 3 or 4, which,
right.
is much easier and more fun.
Yeah. Okay, so Chris, can you tell us some of your early research? What specifically were you working on, and where did that lead you toward or even away from?
Yeah. Well, the first significant paper I've put out on mindfulness in the workplace was a huge team effort with a bunch of colleagues in the Journal of Management called Contemplating Mindfulness, an Integrative Review. And so this paper came out of essentially a frustration of every time I'd go to write something in a traditional format around mindfulness at work, there'd be all this super cool research that I'd be pulling on, and it would be in neuroscience or psychology or medicine or whatever. And, it's like, you're really in the weeds. You're talking about millisecond response times as people react to like little stimuli, and,
right.
Talking about the density of material in this particular brain region and all that. And, it's like so powerful and interesting. And yet, in a typical management journal article, you just can't bring that stuff in any kind of coherent way. There's no time, there's no space. People don't understand this stuff. So it was very frustrating to feel like I couldn't sort of bring these two pieces together. And we just got frustrated, and we're like, you know what, let's just try to review it and sort of let's just try to bring in all this really cool research into, at least a basic theory, or at least a theoretical framework for understanding how mindfulness impacts people at work.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, well, that sounds great. But of course the catch is that the catch there is that, how do you do that? How do you translate all this complicated information?
Yeah.
So we ended up building a big team. We had myself and my close collaborator, Darren Good, who's at Pepperdine University. We were sort of like, sort of initiating the project. But then we grabbed a bunch of people from psychology and neuroscience and medicine. We also partnered with a couple more experienced management researchers. They're real experts in the field. And so we built this big team, basically so we could confidently migrate all this really interesting evidence, package it into a format that could be digested by management scholars, and then try to think ahead and think like, okay, what are the big picture questions and perspectives we can offer on mindfulness in the workplace. So, eventually what we came up with was we tried to make it pretty simple and accessible to, normal people, because we figured, this should be something that should be shared broadly with people who do lots of kinds of research or different aspects of the work world. What we came away with, the big picture was, mindfulness helps people with their attention. They're not only more focused in terms of, not getting distracted, but they tend to stay more present. They don't get pulled out and thinking about the past and the future. And the amazing thing is they might actually be able to attend to more stuff. Like if you don't have all these thoughts pinging around your mind, maybe your brain actually changes, you might actually be able to attend to more things, which is really valuable. So then, okay, so you're attending differently. What does that help you with? Well, it might help you think better. Maybe you're more creative, or maybe you can process a little more information. Maybe you're emotionally a little more stable. You don't react so negatively. You're less quick to fly off the handle. If you do get upset, maybe you more quickly return to your sort of normal state.
Right.
Maybe you can manage your behavior better. There's a lot of evidence about better self-regulation. So, I set a long-term goal, and I don't get sort of hijacked by all the little things that happen along the way. And even it helps your body, like you might not react in terms of stress so much, or, maybe it slows your aging process. So there's all kinds of wild things happening. And then, okay, what does that do? If your functioning changes minute by minute, second by second, in terms of how you're thinking, how you're focusing, and so on, that can help you in 3 main areas. One, helps you with well-being. And this is obviously very well studied. I don't think there's anything particularly innovative there. There's all kinds of powerful impacts you've probably seen. What I thought was more interesting was to think about, how does mindfulness impact how people perform at work, and how does it impact their relationships at work? And these areas, I think there's much less evidence for. Certainly you would think if someone's, got better focus and they're better at self-management and they're thinking more clearly and so on, they're probably going to perform better.
Mm-hmm.
But, we're still at the point of trying to figure out what does that actually look like? Can we get evidence where that actually plays out? So I'd say that's sort of an important next step for the field, is really pinning that down. And I think, it's exciting. You'd imagine if someone's calmer, they're more attentive to other people, they're less focused on themselves and so forth. They could build better relationships. They could engage tricky interactions more effectively, and so on. So that's what that paper does. Is it sort of packages the evidence and then tries to think through at least some of these high level implications of it. One of the things that came out of that paper as we worked was that, mindfulness, it's not just like a tweak of how you normally think. It's actually like an entirely different way for your mind to operate. And so much so that we felt like we had to sort of come up with almost a new terminology around this, or draw on existing terminology, but hasn't really been focused on in management. And that specifically is mindfulness acts like a being mode of mind. It's really how we relate to our moment by moment experience. Whereas what we're usually in the workplace, of course, is what we call the doing mode of mind.
Right.
John Kabat-Zinn came up with this terminology along with his colleague, Mark Williams, and they've published on that. But we're trying to draw this and say, yeah, this is actually a really powerful framework for understanding mindfulness at work. Because if we're usually trying to achieve something, like, you're writing a memo for tomorrow, well, what are you doing? Well, you're thinking about concepts you've learned in the past. You're thinking about automatic routines, about how do you do this particular type of analysis or write a report. You're thinking who's going to read it? How are they going to react? How does that impact our organization? What you're not doing is being in the moment. You're not being accepting. You're making judgments and evaluations very consistently. So, this is, the fact you can be mindful in this context that demands you to constantly do stuff, it's actually really tricky. Like, I don't think we really understand it very well. Yeah. And that was part of our work, was just talking to people, like, what happens? And people reported basically they actually feel like they can have both of these going at the same time, which is pretty interesting. Like, how can you be both accepting and judgmental at the same time? Your subordinate is screwed up, and you sort of accept them as a person and you want to relate to them and help them, while you're also saying, yeah, you kind of screwed up the budgeting and we got to fix it now, and here's what we got to do. And yeah, I'm a little frustrated with you. Yeah. And so on. So to me, that's trying to understand, how it is that people are mindful at work and what that looks like, I think is really important. It also shows the challenges that come out of it. People struggle with this. Like, they'd get stuck, like they'd get caught up in frustration, in judgment of like this person who did that thing, and man, I just can't let go. And, right. I think anyone who's tried to be mindful in work, like, sooner or later, you're going to run into one of these experiences, maybe a lot of times, right? Where you're really trying to be present, but, you're worried what's your boss going to say tomorrow, or whatever it is.
Right.
So I think that's a really interesting avenue for future exploration. I think we've started to sort of map this terrain, but we certainly haven't figured out everything there by any stretch.
Yeah, no, really interesting, Chris. Wow, there's a lot in there, And, I think your ability to talk about the benefits in ways that are accessible and important in the workplace, to kind of really take it out of, like hardcore research language and say, look, you're going to have more mental flexibility and more overall well-being. And, but it also sounds like this opened up, the research raised more questions. That
usually does.
Yeah, so then, you can begin to follow that track as well, and, keep sort of picking apart at that and doing the research. So that's really, really awesome. And where can people find that paper?
The Journal of Management paper, I mean, certainly if you have access to academic journals, it's on their website. But if you just search on Google Scholar, I believe there's some other PDFs that are available for download, if I'm not mistaken. And the Being Well Doing paper, that's published in the journal Frontiers in Psychology. So that's an open source journal, so anyone can download that paper.
Great. Okay, that's good.
We also have some blog posts on London School of Economics. They have an online blog. So we created little mini snippets that are maybe a little more accessible if you don't, for example, want to read an entire academic paper. You can
nice.
Some of the
the Cliff Note version. Yeah.
Exactly. There you go.
Good. That's awesome. Thank you. What, in your opinion, would be some of the biggest barriers and challenges to introducing this in corporate environments? I mean, now, we do have a little bit of history now with this, modality being brought into corporate settings, but from your perspective as a researcher in the business world, what do you think would be barriers or challenges to bringing it in?
Yeah, honestly, I think this is a great area of study, and I don't think we've really figured it out, right? In fact, I'm not even sure we've really started to figure it out, much less really crack that nut. I think there's a lot of different things, and I'm gleaning together little snippets from here and there. For one, I feel like mindfulness is very countercultural in most organizational environments, right? Like, you're expected to work really hard. You're expected to look like you're working really hard. You're expected to put out lots of stuff, react very quickly, not necessarily rock the boat or step back and look at things from a different perspective. You're certainly in many environments not supposed to be meditating at your desk instead of, furiously typing out a memo or phone calling, right? Yeah. So to actually invest yourself in being mindful, cultivate that and enact that in the workplace sort of requires an ability to buck the culture to some reasonable extent and to have a culture that's at least willing to tolerate some level of idiosyncrasy or countercultural behavior, or however it's seen. If there's a hyper-conformist culture that's very busy and you're off doing that, I think, that really creates some dissonance. Two, I think a lot of times when you look at mindfulness, the benefits of that may not manifest immediately. Like, it may be huge, but it may take a while. For instance, just speaking statistically, like if I'm trying to, reduce long-term stress-related costs of my employees, mindfulness is probably an amazing investment. But, do I get that money back next quarter? Probably not. Maybe next year. It's like the benefits of that are often very diffusely connected in terms of time, in terms of me, like whatever manager is authorizing the funding to pay for some training or whatever.
Yeah.
So, I think a lot of times there's a bit of a leap that has to happen. People have to say, this is really meaningful and important, as opposed to, I can justify this in a usual spreadsheet kind of way.
Right.
It's like just add up the costs and benefits and, this is a, great ROI or so on. So not to say there aren't a lot of people who take that leap. In fact, it seems like there's more and more who take that leap, which is really cool. And, no doubt, in part due to all the science, if you have all this evidence showing, for example, that it, slows down how your brain ages and how your cells age and so on. It's like, wow, okay. Like, I don't know if I can add it all up, but that sounds amazing. Let's go ahead and do it. So those are some of the things. I'm sure there's a dozen more, but those are two that are top of mind.
No, that's helpful, Chris. I think, also there's still a contingent of people in corporate settings that don't really know what mindfulness is. So it's, there can be some of those hurdles as well, just kind of educating, but
Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions, like who hasn't heard of mindfulness at this point, but what does that actually mean, right? Like, I think there can be, 20 years ago, not everyone had heard of it. And if they had, they might've thought very ill of it. Now everyone's heard of it and some people think very positively of it, but there may not be a lot of clarity as to what that means, what that looks like, how that shows up.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. What do you think, when introducing mindfulness in the workplace, what do you think people need to be aware of? Like, what would be the success factors to, having a corporate mindfulness program? What do you think is needed? Does it depend on the culture of the company? There's probably a lot of factors there.
Yeah, this feels more like, frankly, more of a dialogue between us more than, I have the expertise, because you guys are out there every day working with organizations. I guess I'll say, I think it's important to convey there's a lot of research legitimacy around this. It's, 20, 30 years ago, we were kind of waving your hands and say, it'll make you feel better, right? And that's sort of the pitch. Now it's like, it'll literally reorganize your brain in some really awesome ways, and so on and so forth. So, I think there's plenty of evidence around that. But I think to me, it's the next phase of evolution is more, how does this fit into your life? How does this fit into your corporation, your work life, and so on? And it's almost more of like a conversation around creativity. It's less around a sales pitch. And
Yes.
it's like, try it out and then think about like, okay, if it does work for you, how do you fit it in? Like, can you, do you meditate in meetings? Do you meditate, like take 2 minutes at lunch, or,
Right.
is it really for you something you do at home? Or is it really just, you kind of tune in very briefly to your breath, every now and then, or, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's almost like it's not like you, the mindfulness trainer or the executive, is saying, okay, here's this thing, take it, right? It's kind of more like you're sort of offering something and saying, try it out and see where it goes.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I like that, Chris, because you're not being prescriptive. I mean, it's like, in a way, what you're saying is you really can't be prescriptive. It's more a creation and because of a dialogue.
yeah, I think so. And, again, initially, maybe people were so skeptical of this that, it was kind of, you needed some science just to say it's legitimate. It's not just
right.
But I think there's preponderance of evidence showing that there's legitimacy around this. So it's it's at least worthy of giving it a try if you want to have any of the 100 benefits associated with it.
Yeah. I love that. At least 100 benefits.
At least 100 benefits. Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. Even that doesn't work, right, sometimes. So then what's the question of, if you can say it does all these kinds of amazing things and it's so simple, then why not do more of it? But the reality is not everyone does. And in fact, there's, a lot of discomfort with it, at least in some contexts for that.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, the other thing that strikes me, Chris, too, is that whoever is doing the actual instruction really needs to have a long history in practice. And that, I think, can be a little bit problematic. If you don't get the right person in there that really understands this practice for themselves, and then they are teaching it. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that makes sense. Again, it's kind of many ways, it's almost a victim, or it's maybe not a victim, it's a casualty of the success of interest in mindfulness, is that now suddenly it's this cool thing, and it's actually, on the surface, it's quite simple. So then it's sort of everyone, or not everyone, but many people want to be involved with it and say, I don't doubt many people are very sincere about it, but it's it's kind of like fine wine or fine spirits, right? It's like, you don't necessarily want to grab the bottle, after it's been on the shelf for 3 months. You might want to let it sit for another 10 or 20 years before you crack it open.
Chris, I love that analogy. And I also love what you said, that you believe the intentions are really good, and the practice appears to be simple, and but it's really quite subtle and complex, and there is a simplicity to it. So
and I think it's also, there's still a sense of what consciousness you carry as a trainer, right? And it's one thing to, be able to do the audio instructions around a breath meditation. I think that's sort of like a minimal level of competency.
Yeah, sure.
But, where are you while you're doing that? And, I think there can be a tremendous depth of mindfulness that goes with that, or, you can be kind of just, like, you could be literally reading from a script, right? And I think that to me at least feels like a missing piece. And I don't have any evidence on this. This is not a scientific insight. This is just anecdotal experience. But you can feel when someone's in that energy or when someone's not. It's like, would you want George from Seinfeld, reading a meditation to you? Like, it probably wouldn't be very effective, right? Like, he's intentionally a very mindless, neurotic character, right? And it's like, it puts you in that mentality as opposed to where you want to go, which is being more present and more accepting and so on. So that's of course an extreme example. But it's like, there's still a big difference between that and really deepening in your personal expertise. In consciousness.
If you think sort of pie in the sky and you had a dream project, something that you just think would be fun to work on, really valuable for sort of the cause of bringing this into companies. Like, do you have a dream project in the future or now?
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine, I literally dream mindfulness research all day. So yes, I have lots of dreams. If you're saying like, what would be something that would be really exciting to work on? I guess a couple of things come to mind. The first would be, I'd just like to see some company that's really struggling with some large scale issue. I think the COVID crisis presents one opportunity is, if not literally everyone, almost everyone's been wildly disrupted by this crisis. Like I know
Absolutely.
my school and my industry has, I'm sure many others have.
Yeah.
It's hard, right? Like, what do? You still have to kind of, for us, we have to keep the students coming in. We still have to teach classes, do research, all that kind of, keep the buildings working and so on.
Right.
But you have to do it in a completely different way because of this new reality. I think it'd be neat to have a large scale mindfulness intervention for an organization dealing with that and trying to see how does that shift how people deal with these kinds of things. I guess my general perspective is that mindfulness offers a lot of really valuable things that play out in a lot of different ways. It's not just focus and stress relief, although those are very important. So, it'd be neat, like, does it help the community have better relationships together, for example? Does it help them be more flexible in terms of their strategy or adapting, like for me, like I have to learn to teach in this new environment. Students have to learn how to learn in this new environment effectively and so on.
Right.
I think that would be super cool. I guess the other thing that really stands out to me is the medical sector. I think it'd be really interesting to look at what's the relationship between mindfulness and medical quality. I've seen a little bit of this, but when you look at really hardcore medical research around those quality indicators, whether it's medication errors or surgical errors or building better patient relationships, or there's any number of ways you could go around that. Doing a really good study of that, I think, would be super cool. Challenging, but my dream.
So Chris, do you think in your professional lifetime, your students will have more positions open to them in corporate, in the corporate environment, positions like I have as a, kind of a manager, director level position? Do you think there'll be more of that in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think it'd be neat to think that, it's really hard to say, and I think there's also a question of what's the most effective way to integrate mindfulness into your organization, which is clearly an open question. Is it better to have some sort of figurehead leader around it? Is it something that you sort of distribute to people, like everyone, every group has someone who's sort of the captain in their little niche or something? Is it sort of distributed nowadays through smartphones or, whatever, webinars or whatever else? I think the one thing that does seem clear to me is that there's a greatly increased emphasis on wellness and well-being in organizations. 10, 20 years ago, people just weren't focused on it. And now it's like most organizations, at least they talk the talk of trying to promote employee wellness. Whether that actually always plays out is maybe not so clear. But it's like there's still this emphasis of we got to have some people working on employee well-being if you're an organization of any size. So I think my guess is a lot of times mindfulness might be a component of that, at least. If you're a big enough group, or maybe there's somebody who really specializes in mindfulness or so on. I can certainly imagine that. And I can also imagine there's a lot more opportunity for consultants or other kinds of trainers. It's like there may be organizations that then go provide this to other organizations, because not everybody's going to be as big as like the Aetnas and HPHCs of the world, right? It's like where you can have dedicated people for that.
Right,
you might be a 50-person law firm. Like you're probably not gonna have a dedicated mindfulness only person in some context. Like you'd be lucky to have someone who has a quarter or half time responsibilities for it, right?
Right, yeah. So when you think about colleagues and mentors over the years, is there kind of support, feedback, advice, something that you've received that has been helping you to do your work?
Yeah, I guess, when I was starting and looking for PhD programs, I had a professor who suggested, you got to go someplace you're comfortable. They're going to celebrate you for being you. And I mean, it sounds kind of trite and, we could put it on a poster, but like, it's really true. It's, for me, it's when you can find that groove, the place that supports you and kind of like you being you. To me, at least, it really changes the game, because you can really put yourself fully into the work. So I'd say that's the most important thing from my perspective.
Yeah.
And I guess for me, it's just, I've heard the difference between successful and unsuccessful academics is oftentimes it's not intellect or, or there's lots of things you might think that actually don't matter. What matters is just grit. You got to keep going. And because it's like, generally speaking, it doesn't necessarily happen that easily. So you just got to be willing to keep pushing. And, you try one thing, it doesn't work. The next, it doesn't work. You got to try the third and the fourth and the fifth. And
Yeah.
it's certainly been my experience. And, I feel like finally now, been doing this for about 10 years, like the gears are kind of clicking, but it's taken a while to get to that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds like perseverance and trust is like so important that and mindfulness can inform that, it can support it for sure. So if you weren't studying mindfulness, what would you be doing?
Yeah, on that one, I really don't know. It feels like the question kind of terrifies me, to be honest. It feels like this is the right path, and I really have no idea what else I'd be doing professionally. I mean, if I wasn't doing it, like maybe I'd be out like kayaking or windsurfing or something really cool, which I never do these days. But it sounds great.
Well, that in itself says a lot. You love this work, and you feel like you're on, the right trajectory. You're doing exactly what your little 13-year-old person didn't know you would be doing. But how interesting!
Hardware vision.
Yeah, that this has all come together for you professionally and has such deep meaning personally. I mean, that's as good as it gets. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't? Like, is there anything else you'd like to say that I haven't asked?
No, I mean, it's been very in-depth. It's lovely being here, and just exciting to be sort of working with folks like you who are actually engaging in the real world and helping folks out by sharing mindfulness, or at least giving people the opportunity to find that within themselves. So I always love engaging with you guys. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, likewise, Chris. It's a pleasure to have you on the program, and we really appreciate the work that you're doing, because the work that you're doing is supporting our work. So thank you so much.
Feelings mutual.